Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 1. The sample arrived in a small, cold container, labeled in plain text, slid across the shared counter without ceremony. Rael looked at it the way someone looks at a pebble they almost stepped on briefly, then away. Human genetic material, Sova said, reading the tag. Survey batch 7. Process it with the others, Rael said. He was already back at his own screen, reviewing protein chain data from a Voran agricultural colony. Important work. Real work. The joint lab on Relay 7 had been running for 3 years. The station sat at the edge of neutral space, built for exactly this kind of thing, 2 species working in the same room, sharing equipment, sharing data, staying out of each other's way. The Voran side of the lab was spotless. Every instrument in its marked position. Every reading logged the moment it was taken. The human side was also functional, just noisier. There were handwritten labels stuck to things. A spare jacket hung over a chair. A small plant sat in the corner that had no scientific purpose at all. Sova did not mind the plant. She had looked it up once. It was called a pothos. It could survive almost anything. She placed the human sample into the sequencer and set the parameters. Standard survey scan. Low priority. Estimated time 40 minutes. Nora came in 12 minutes late. She did not apologize. She set her tool kit on the counter, washed her hands at the side sink and said to nobody in particular, "Coolant fault in corridor 7 is fixed. You're welcome." Rael glanced up. He had seen the fault report 3 days ago. The maintenance team had flagged it for a specialist. He looked at the tool kit. The repair seal on the side clasp still had grease on it. He looked back at his screen. Lita was already at the human workstation, pulling up secondary atmospheric data from a sample collected near a volcanic shelf. She was younger than Nora by about 10 years and moved through the lab like she had grown up in one. "You eat anything this morning?" she asked without turning around. "I had intentions," Nora said, sitting down. "That's a no." Nora pulled up the batch queue. She saw the human sample running in sequencer 3 and felt nothing in particular about it. Survey work was survey work. She opened a nutrient bar from her pocket and started reading a separate report on calcium deposits in deep-sea microbial mats. 38 minutes passed. The sequencer finished. Sova pulled the readout to her screen and began reviewing it the way she reviewed all of them, top to bottom. Flag anything unusual. Move on. She was halfway through the chromosome mapping when she stopped. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked. The markers in Section 4 of the mapping did not match anything in the Voran biological catalog, not even approximately. They were structured, tight, almost deliberate in arrangement. Every other species survey this year had returned catalog data with minor variations. This had something sitting in it that had no entry anywhere. "Rael," she said. "One moment." "Rael." He came over. He looked at the screen. He was quiet for 4 seconds, which, for Rael, was a long time. "Contamination," he said. "Rerun the prep and rescan." "I followed standard prep," Sova said carefully. "Then the sequencer has residual material from a previous sample. Clean the chamber and rescan." Nora had heard the word contamination. In a lab, that word had a specific sound to it, low and certain, the sound of someone closing a door before checking what was behind it. She stood up and walked over. "Can I see?" Rael did not move aside immediately. Then he did. Nora looked at the readout. She was quiet for longer than Sova had been. Lita came and stood behind her, looked over her shoulder and said nothing either. The markers were sitting right there in the middle of an otherwise readable human genome scan. Clean, structured, and completely unknown. "That's not contamination," Nora said. "The sequencer." "It's not the sequencer." She pointed at the screen without touching it. "These markers have a pattern. Contamination scatters. This doesn't scatter. This is organized." Rael's expression did not change much. It rarely did. An organized contaminant is still a contaminant. Nora turned and looked at him directly. I've seen structures like this before, not in a lab, in fossil record data. Human paleogenomics, pre-modern samples, material going back 300,000 years. She paused. These markers are not new. They're very, very old. The room was quiet for a moment. The sequencer on the far side of the lab beeped once, a different sample, finished, unrelated. Rail turned back to the screen. He did not say anything. He just looked at the data again, slowly, the way someone looks at a map when they realize the road they have been walking does not appear on it. Sova looked at Nora. Nora was already pulling up the fossil record archive on her own terminal. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions. Relay 7 turned slowly in neutral space, carrying its small collection of quiet discoveries, waiting, as it always had, to see what came next. Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 2. Rail reran the scan himself. He cleaned the sequencer chamber with a fresh, sterile kit, used a new sample draw from the same container, set the parameters manually, and waited. Sova watched him without comment. Nora stayed at her own station, pulling fossil record files, cross-referencing dates and sample origins. The second scan finished. The markers were still there, same position, same structure, same complete absence from the Vorin catalog. Rail sat back in his chair and said nothing for a long moment. Then he transferred the readout to the shared central screen, the large display between both workstations that neither team used much because it required cooperation to operate. He did it without announcing it. It was simply the most practical surface for what needed to happen next. Sova began the cross-reference quietly. She pulled Earth's historical environmental data, full record, deep time, and began laying it against the chromosome map. She was looking for any correlation between the marker positions and known biological stress events. It was a routine analytical step. She expected nothing. What came back was not nothing. The first marker cluster aligned with a period approximately 70,000 years ago. She checked the Earth record. Toba, a supervolcanic eruption large enough to drop global temperatures for years, collapse food chains, reduce the human population to a few thousand individuals at most. A near-extinction event. She moved to the second cluster, 120,000 years ago. A prolonged glacial period so severe that most of the African continent's interior became uninhabitable. Third cluster, 40,000 years ago. Rapid climate destabilization, evidence of massive mammal die-offs, cascading ecosystem collapse across 3 continents. Sova kept going. Each cluster had a match, not approximate, aligned. Every major near-extinction event on Earth had left a corresponding shift in the human genome, sitting right there in the data like a scar that had healed into something stronger. She said quietly, "Nora." Nora came over. Sova walked her through it without editorializing, just the dates, the events, the alignment. Nora listened. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had suspected something for a long time and was now watching it confirmed. Each event changed the genome, Rail asked. He was standing at the edge of the display, arms at his sides. Not randomly, Sova said. The shifts are structured. They don't look like damage. They look like, she paused, reaching for the right word, response. Rail was quiet. Nora spoke then, not to explain herself or to impress anyone. She just laid it out plainly. 5 major extinction-level events, ice ages that lasted centuries, a volcanic winter that blocked the sun for years, plagues that moved through populations with no resistance and no treatment, asteroid and impact debris events. Each one should have ended the species. Several of them came close enough that the fossil and genetic record showed clear population collapse. And each time, something in the human body had shifted at the genomic level, not evolved in the traditional slow drift sense, but reorganized, as if the genome had an emergency protocol. No other species in the catalog shows this pattern, Rail asked. No other species in your catalog survived this many events in this short a time frame, Nora said. Not defensively, just factually. Rail walked back to his station and stood there without sitting down. The Vorin Collective had been conducting biological surveys for 4,000 years. In that time, they had cataloged over 900 species. Their own genome had been stable for 11 millennia. Stability was the mark of advancement, a species that no longer needed to change because it had built an environment that protected it. That was the model. That was the standard. A species reshaped by catastrophe was not supposed to look like this. Lita, who had been eating a meal pack at the far corner of the lab and pretending not to listen, said quietly, "Is this a good thing or a bad thing?" Nobody answered her immediately. Sova pulled up one more layer of the analysis, a section she had flagged earlier and set aside. She had not mentioned it yet because she had wanted to be sure. "There's more," she said. She put it on the shared screen. A second set of sequences, sitting deeper in the human genome than the extinction markers. These were different. They were not the scarred and repaired sections. They were something else entirely, long, dense, compressed sequences that showed no activation markers, no transcription history, no evidence of ever having been used. "Dormant," Nora said softly. "Completely," Sova confirmed. "No activation in any sample across the entire human survey batch. Whatever these are, they have never switched on." "Can you tell what they would produce?" Rail asked. "Not without modeling the activation pathway," Sova said. "We don't have enough data yet. We don't even know what the trigger would be." The shared screen held the image. A long ribbon of unused code sitting inside a species that had already rewritten itself 5 times under pressure, and apparently had more left in reserve that had never been touched. Lita set down her meal pack very carefully. Outside the viewport, nothing had changed. The stars were where they always were. Relay 7 continued its slow turn. But in the lab, something had shifted, the same way things shift when a door opens onto a room that turns out to be much larger than the hallway suggested. Rail sat down. He pulled the data toward himself and started reading it again from the beginning. Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 3. Sova built the simulation overnight. Nobody asked her to. Nobody told her to stop either. By the time the station's lighting had cycled back to day brightness, she had a working model of the dormant sequences under 7 different stress conditions: high radiation, oxygen depletion, extreme temperature variance, prolonged cellular trauma from toxin exposure, electromagnetic pulse saturation, and 2 others that existed in the theoretical range, things no living human had ever encountered. In 6 of the 7 conditions, the dormant sequences did not respond. In the 7th, a combination of sustained radiation and total atmospheric pressure collapse, the kind of environment that would exist on a planet losing its magnetosphere, the sequences lit up. Sova stared at what the model produced, and then immediately saved a backup copy to a separate drive, sealed the simulation, and sat back in her chair with her hands flat on the table. She had not expected that. When Rail came in and saw her face, he asked what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I just don't know what right looks like yet." She showed him the simulation. He watched it run twice without speaking. Then he asked her to run it again. Nora arrived with Lita a few minutes later. Sova showed them the model without commentary and let them watch. The dormant sequences, under that specific combination of conditions, did not simply activate. They appeared to begin restructuring surrounding genetic material, not destroying it, reorganizing it. The model projected cellular changes at a rate that had no biological equivalent in the Vorin catalog. "What does that mean for the organism?" Nora asked. "The model doesn't go far enough to say," Sova said. "The projection ends at the cellular restructuring phase. Whatever comes after that, We'd need a live sample under real conditions to see, and obviously we're not going to do that. Obviously, Lita agreed very quietly. Rael was still looking at the screen. The activation trigger is environmental, he said, not internal. The genome doesn't decide to switch these on. Something outside the body forces the decision. Which means a human under normal conditions would never know these existed, Nora said. No human ever has, Sova said. Not in any medical record or genetic survey we can find. These sequences have been sitting there completely silent for as long as the fossil record goes back, which is, she checked her notes, at least 400,000 years. The lab was quiet for a moment. Nora moved to her station and opened a comm channel. The frequency connected to a relay point 3 systems out, and from there bounced to the fleet command post where Admiral Dre Cass maintained his watch rotation. The connection took about 40 seconds to stabilize. When it did, Cass's voice came through clear and level. "Hail. We have findings you need to know about," Nora said. "Human Genome Survey, Relay 7 Batch 7. The short version is that we found something unexpected in the baseline DNA, something significant." Define significant. Genetic structures that don't appear in any other species catalog. Evidence that the human genome has undergone structured reorganization in response to 5 separate extinction-level events, and a set of dormant sequences with unknown function that have never activated in recorded history. There was a pause on the line. Then Cass said, "Does any of this represent a risk?" "We don't know yet." Another pause. "Then keep working. Send me the data package when you have a full report." "Understood." "Good work, Hale." The line closed. Lita raised her eyebrows. "That's it. That's the whole conversation." "He's not a details person," Nora said. "He just needed to know it was real and that we weren't stopping." Rael had been standing at the far side of the lab while Nora spoke to Cass. When she closed the channel, he was looking out the viewport, not at anything specific, just out. 200 years ago, he said, not turning around, the Vorin Collective sent an evaluation team to observe the human species. Standard survey, behavioral patterns, social development, technological progress, biological baseline. He paused. The final classification was non-critical. A young species with high internal conflict rates and low projected galactic contribution, not a priority for continued study. Nora looked at the back of his head. If this data had existed then, he continued, or if the evaluation team had looked at the genome at this level, the classification would have been different. "What would it have been?" Sova asked. Rael turned around. His expression was the same as always, measured, precise, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there yesterday. Not guilt exactly, something quieter than that. "I don't know," he said. "We don't have a classification for this." Nora nodded once, slowly. She did not say anything like "I told you so" or "you should have looked harder." There was nothing useful in any of that. She just turned back to the data and kept working. Lita, who had been watching all of it, picked up her tool kit and started recalibrating the secondary sequencer without being asked. That was when the panel on the main wall of the lab chimed once, the tone reserved for priority communications, not from the fleet, from the Vorin Collective's administrative relay. Sova read the header and looked at Rael. "Elder Voss," she said. "He is coming to Relay 7 personally." Rael did not look surprised. He looked like someone who had been expecting a knock at the door and had just heard it. "When?" he said. 14 hours. The lab stayed quiet. The sequencer kept running. The pothos in the corner sat in its small patch of artificial light, growing as it always did, without asking anyone's permission. Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 4. Elder Weiss did not walk fast. He moved through Relay 7's corridors the way a very old building holds itself, deliberately, with the weight of everything it has stood through. His two security officers stayed a half step behind him, quiet as furniture. His silver robe had no decoration except a single narrow band at the collar that marked his rank in the collective, something only another Vorin would recognize. He went to the meeting room first, not the lab. Rael was called in alone. Nora and Sova waited in the corridor outside. Lita sat on the floor with her back against the wall, eating something wrapped in foil, pretending she was not paying attention to the closed door. "How long do you think they'll be?" Sova asked. "As long as it takes," Nora said. "That's not an answer." "No," Nora agreed. They waited 22 minutes. When the door opened, Rael came out first. His face was unreadable, which for Rael meant something had been said that he was still processing. Voss appeared in the doorway behind him, looked at Nora with calm, colorless eyes and said, "Dr. Hale, please come in." The meeting room was on the Vorin side of the station, cold white surfaces, no windows, a long table with 4 chairs, nothing on the walls. The kind of room that was designed to hold conversations without holding onto them. Voss sat down. He gestured to the chair across from him. Nora sat. Sova had tried to follow, and the security officer near the door had shifted just slightly, not blocking, not threatening, just indicating. Sova stayed in the corridor. "I have read the preliminary findings," Voss said. "Rael sent a summary as a courtesy before my arrival." "Good," Nora said. "I want to say first that the quality of the analysis is not in question. The methodology appears sound. I have no objection to the science itself." "But," Nora said. Voss looked at her without irritation. He had been in rooms with difficult people for a very long time. But the implications of releasing this data to the broader galactic community require careful thought. There are over 40 recognized species with active diplomatic relationships in this region. Several of them have complex histories with humanity. Presenting information that fundamentally reframes what humans are, what they may be capable of, without managing the context could produce responses that are difficult to predict. "You mean some of them might be frightened?" Nora said. "Yes. And you think the solution to that is to not tell them?" Voss folded his hands on the table. "I think the solution is to determine the right moment, the right framing, and the right channels before anything is published. Classification is not suppression. It is management." Nora looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad person. She had worked near Vorin administrators before, and she could tell the difference between someone who wanted to hide things for power and someone who genuinely believed control was the same thing as care. Voss was the second kind, which in some ways made it harder. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "If we delay this, manage it, frame it, release it slowly through proper channels over the next several years, what do 40 species spend that time believing about humans?" Voss did not answer immediately. "They believe what the current evaluation says," Nora continued. "Non-critical, unstable, low projected contribution. That's the active record. That's what informs every diplomatic decision, every resource allocation, every conversation about whether humanity deserves a seat at any table." She kept her voice even. "Classifying this data doesn't protect anyone. It just keeps the wrong information in place a little longer." The room was quiet. Voss said, "I will consider what you've said." Which was not a yes, but it was not the door closing either. Nora went back to the lab. Sova was not in the corridor. She found her inside, alone at the Vorin workstation in the dark. The overhead lights were off and she was working by screen light only, both hands moving fast across the input surface, eyes fixed on something that had her entire attention. "Sova." Sova turned. Her expression was the one people get when they have found something they did not go looking for and are not sure if they are glad they found it. "I was running the cross-species comparison," she said. "Standard background check, See if any of the dormant sequence structures had analogs in other cataloged genomes. I expected nothing. Every previous check this week came back empty. She turned the screen toward Nora. These two species, she said, pointing, both have faint traces, not the full sequence, not enough to activate, but the structural signature is there, embedded in non-coding regions, same position relative to the chromosome anchor points. Nora looked at the species designations. She did not recognize the common names, but she recognized the contact history tags attached to them. Both species had documented prolonged contact with early human populations, one during a migration period approximately 40,000 years ago, one during an early settlement expansion around 22,000 years ago. It transferred, Nora said. Not like a virus, Sova said quickly. There's no damage, no mutation scarring. It looks more like, I don't have a better word for it, like something that moved between species the way habits move between people, through proximity, through time. Nora stood very still for a moment. Does Rail know? Not yet, you're the first person I've told. Nora looked at the door to the corridor, then back at the screen. Document everything. Full analysis, full methodology, every data point. Then send an encrypted copy off station. Tonight, to Cass. Sova's hands were already moving. Nora stood beside her and watched the data compile, and did not say another word until the transmission confirmed sent. Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 5. Cass did not sit on the data. Within 4 hours of receiving Nora's transmission, he had forwarded the complete package, analysis, methodology, dormant sequence model, cross-species findings, all of it, to 3 independent research institutions. The Interspecies Science Cooperative on Heron Station, the Biological Survey Archive at Deepwell, the Open Access Research Network maintained by the Neutral Academic Council that had no political affiliation with anyone. By the time Voss was informed, the data existed in 14 separate locations across 2 sectors. Rail delivered the news to Voss in the meeting room, alone, and came back to the lab looking like a man who had just watched something fall and had made peace with not catching it. Voss called for a brief meeting, not in the formal room this time. He came to the lab itself, which he had not done before. He stood at the edge of the shared central display, his 2 officers behind him, and looked at the data still running on the screens. Nobody spoke first. Finally, Voss said, "The transmission originated from this lab." "Yes," Nora said. "You anticipated my recommendation. I acted on my own judgment before your recommendation was made. There's a difference." Voss looked at her. His expression was not angry. It was the expression of someone who had spent a long career managing outcomes and was now watching one go past him without stopping. "You understood what releasing this would mean." "I understood what not releasing it would mean," Nora said, "for longer than necessary." Rail was standing at his own station. He had not moved to either side of the room. He was simply present, which for Rail was its own kind of statement. Voss looked at the data on the screen. The dormant sequences, the extinction markers, the cross-species traces. He had read the analysis 3 times on the transit from his ship to the station. He was not a biologist, but he had governed long enough to understand what things meant even when he could not read the technical language that described them. "I will withdraw the classification request," he said. He said it to the room, not to any one person. Rail handed him a data pad with the formal withdrawal form already open. It took Nora a half-second to realize Rail had prepared it before the meeting. He had known. He had decided. Voss signed it. The transmission confirmed sent in the same small tone that all confirmed transmissions made: unimpressive, ordinary, final. He handed the pad back to Rail. He looked once more at the screen. Then he and his officers left the lab and the door slid closed behind them. Lita, from her corner, said, Is it always like this? Like what? Nora asked. High stakes, low volume. Everyone very quiet while enormous things happen. Usually, Nora said. Later that cycle, when the station lights had gone low and Lita had gone to sleep and Sova had retreated to her quarters, Nora and Rael were both still in the lab. Not because there was urgent work, because neither of them had stopped. The full analysis was finished. Rael had completed the formal write-up of the dormant sequence model. Nora had appended the fossil record correlations and the cross-species trace findings into a single coherent document. It was clean work, thorough, the kind of paper that would be read for a long time by people they would never meet. Rael looked at the summary on the shared screen. The Vorin Collective will receive this formally through the academic network, he said, along with every other institution. I know, Nora said. There will be a review of the 200-year evaluation. I would expect so. But some members of the collective will not respond well to the findings. Some of them will, Nora said. Rael was quiet for a moment. The screen light was the main source of illumination. Outside the viewport, the stars were where they had always been. The collective has been stable for 11,000 years, he said. Stable genome, stable society, stable record of progress. We built the model of advancement on stability. The idea that disruption, that catastrophe, could produce something we do not have and cannot replicate through careful development, he stopped. Is uncomfortable, Nora offered. It overturns something fundamental, he said. Not just a data point, a belief. Nora thought about that for a moment. She did not try to soften it. The Vorin model isn't wrong, she said. Stability is valuable. It's why your society lasted 11,000 years. But stability assumes the environment stays cooperative. Humanity never had that. Everything we are was built on the assumption that the ground might disappear. She paused. We didn't choose that, but we're still here. Rael looked at the dormant sequences on the screen. 400,000 years of unused potential, sitting quiet and patient in the genome of a species that most of the galaxy had written off as background noise. Do you think those sequences will ever activate? He asked. I think if they ever needed to, they would, Nora said. And if they did? She looked at the screen alongside him. I think that's a question for whatever comes after. Neither of them had anything to add to that. The analysis document sat finished on the screen, waiting to move out into the network and begin the long, unpredictable work of changing what the galaxy thought it knew. Rael read through the final paragraph once more. Then he opened the submission interface. He did not hesitate before sending it. Aliens Uncover Hidden Truths in Human DNA, Part 6. The responses came in over the following 8 days. They did not all come in the same tone. A species called the Murath sent a formal objection through their diplomatic relay, a long document full of careful language that ultimately said they did not appreciate surprises. Another species, the Selvari, requested that the cross-species trace data be removed from the public record on the grounds that it implied a historical connection they had not consented to document. Their request was noted and denied by the Academic Council on the basis that the data was factual, and its publication was within established research standards. These were the loudest responses. They were also the smallest fraction. The rest came in quieter and with more weight. 17 research institutions sent formal requests for access to the full dataset. 12 of them were non-human. 6 species with no previous history of contact with humanity sent brief introductory transmissions to the research team at Relay 7. Not diplomatic contact, not political overture, just scientists reaching toward other scientists through the most direct channel available. 3 species requested joint DNA research programs, not surveys, not evaluations, partnerships. 2 of those 3 were the species whose genomes carried faint traces of the dormant sequences. Sova brought Nora the partnership requests on a data pad one morning while Nora was recalibrating the sequencer. Nora read through them and set the pad down carefully, and then picked it up and read them again. "The Selhari and the Doven," she said. "They contacted the academic council within 6 hours of the paper going live," Sova said. "The Selhari geneticist, her name is Preth. She wrote in the message that she had suspected something unusual in her own genome for years, but had no framework to understand it. She said reading our paper was the first time the data made sense." Nora set down her calibration tool. She thought about Preth, a scientist on some station or planet that Nora had never been to, looking at data that had confused her for years, and then reading something written in a cold lab on Relay 7 and feeling, for the first time, like the pieces fit. That was what the work was for, not the drama with Voss, not the administrative back and forth. That. Rael came in mid-morning with a data pad of his own. He set it on the shared counter in the middle of the lab, the neutral space, and said, "I have submitted a formal correction to the Vorin Collective's historical evaluation of humanity." Nobody had asked him to. Nora looked at the pad. The correction document was thorough, 12 pages of data references, methodology citations, and formal language. At the bottom of the first page, where the classification line had previously read non-critical, Rael had entered unknown potential. "That's the highest rating the collective gives," Sova said. "It's the rating for things we don't have enough information to assess," Rael said, "which is accurate." Nora looked at the classification. Unknown potential. She thought about everything that phrase could mean: the extinction markers, the dormant sequences, the traces in 2 other species' genomes, the fact that humanity had survived 5 near endings without any help from anyone and hadn't even known what it cost them at the cellular level. "It's accurate," she agreed. Lita was packing up secondary equipment near the door, preparing for a transport window later in the day. She had been listening to all of it, as she always did, while appearing to be doing something else entirely. "So what do we do now?" Sova asked. She was looking at Nora, but the question was for everyone. Nora picked up her calibration tool again. "What we do next is figure out what the dormant sequences actually produce. We have a model, we have a trigger condition, and we have 2 species who might carry partial versions. That's a starting point." "That could take years," Sova said. "Yes," Nora said. A calm message arrived at her station. Short from Cass. She read it. "Good work. Come home when you are ready." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it and the simplicity. She thought about home, the fleet post, the crowded corridors, the particular smell of recycled air that she had grown up with. She would go back, but not yet. She opened a new document and started drafting the research proposal for the next phase of the study. Methodology first, then resource requirements, then the question she wanted to answer, written plainly at the top of the page so she would not lose sight of it. What does a human genome do when the worst thing imaginable actually arrives? Sova pulled a chair up beside her and started cross-referencing the Selhari genomic records that Preth had already sent over as an opening gesture of good faith. Lita finished her packing and then, without being asked, put the kettle on. Rael sat at his own station and opened the response from the Vorin Collective's scientific board, already requesting a full briefing on the findings, already forming a working group. He read through the message and then, unexpectedly, added one last line to the official record before closing the document. It was a note in the Galactic Species Archive, the central repository that held what the galaxy understood about every known civilization. The entry for humanity had been mostly unchanged for 2 centuries. Rael added a single annotation at the bottom, authored in his own credentials. "This species has survived conditions that should have ended them, at least 5 times, through mechanisms they did not design and do not yet understand. The assumption that we have correctly measured what they are has been demonstrated to be wrong. further study is warranted. So perhaps is a measure of humility on the part of those of us who thought we already knew. He marked it as a formal scientific note, saved it, and returned to his work. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions, as they always had, be patient, indifferent, and full of things that had not yet been found.